It started with the 911 call that came through at exactly 3:13 a.m. "Help!" A woman's voice whimpered, barely audible over the crackling static. "I'm at Harrowwood. He's coming." The line cut off abruptly, leaving only the faint sound of something, wind, maybe, scraping across the receiver. Dispatch rerouted the call to me and my partner, Detective Aaron Wilkes, with a terse note: possible abduction in progress. Harrowwood wasn't a neighborhood. It was an old industrial district long abandoned, save for squatters and the occasional desperate junkie. Not exactly the kind of place someone would choose for a midnight stroll. As we sped through the city streets, the radio crackled again. This time it wasn't dispatch, it was something else. A faint, distorted hum filled the car. Aaron glanced at me, his hand tightening on the wheel. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, uneasy. Static interference, maybe? But it wasn't static. Beneath the hiss and buzz, a sound emerged. Faint, rhythmic, like footsteps, or the slow, deliberate tick of a clock. The hum grew louder as we approached Harrowwood, fading only when Aaron killed the engine. We stepped out into the suffocating quiet of the district. Rusted warehouses loomed on either side of the street, their broken windows staring down like blind eyes. A single streetlight flickered, casting jagged shadows that danced across the asphalt. Aaron and I exchanged a glance. His hand hovered near the holster on his hip. "Weird place for a prank call," he muttered, his breath visible in the chilly air. "It didn't sound like a prank," I replied, scanning the darkness. My fingers grazed the flashlight clipped to my belt, but something in the air made me hesitate to turn it on. The place had a way of making you feel watched. Dispatch had triangulated the call to a warehouse at the far end of the street. Warehouse 17. It looked no different from the others, hulking, decrepit, forgotten. But as we approached, I noticed something strange. The faint glow of a light spilling from the cracked door. Aaron and I drew our weapons, our footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the empty expanse. I nodded, and he pushed the door open with his shoulder. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and something sharper, metallic. The room was cavernous, littered with rusted machinery and toppled crates. Our flashlights sliced through the gloom, illuminating streaks of graffiti on the walls and the glint of broken glass on the floor. And then I saw it, a trail of footprints in the dust, leading deeper into the warehouse. They were small, like a woman's, but what stopped me cold was the second set, larger, heavier, trailing behind. Aaron caught my eye and motioned for me to follow. We moved slowly, the sound of our boots crunching on debris unnervingly loud. The footprints led us to a corner of the warehouse, where an ancient freight elevator sat wedged open. The faint glow we'd seen earlier was coming from inside, casting the shaft in an eerie orange light. I leaned closer and saw the source, a single, flickering lantern hanging from a frayed rope. "What the hell is this?" Aaron muttered, his voice tight. Before I could answer, a noise echoed from below, a metallic groan, followed by something that sounded disturbingly like a muffled cry. Aaron stepped forward, peering down into the abyss. "There's someone down there." I hesitated. Something about this whole setup was wrong. Every instinct screamed at me to call for backup, but protocol was clear. We had a missing person and no time to waste. "Let's go," I said, reluctantly stepping into the elevator. Aaron followed, and we descended into the dark. The ride was excruciatingly slow, the ancient gears grinding and wheezing as they lowered us into the bowels of the warehouse. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement below, something darting out of sight just beyond the light's reach. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Aaron shook his head, his jaw clenched. "Keep your eyes open." When the elevator finally creaked to a halt, we stepped out into a narrow hallway. The walls were damp and crumbling, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. The muffled cries were louder now, unmistakable and desperate. "This way," Aaron said, his voice low, as he gestured toward a heavy steel door at the end of the hall. I nodded, my heart pounding as we approached. The cries grew frantic, mingling with a strange, rhythmic tapping sound that seemed to reverberate through the walls. Aaron reached for the handle and paused, looking at me. "On 3, he said. I nodded, gripping my weapon tighter. 1, 2, 3. He threw the door open, and I felt the blood drain from my face. Inside was a scene I'll never forget. The room was small, its concrete walls streaked with rust and grime. A single, bare bulb hung from the ceiling, swinging slightly as if it had been recently disturbed. In the center of the room was a chair, and in that chair sat a woman, her hands tied behind her back, her face pale and streaked with tears. She looked up at us, her eyes wide with terror. "Please," she croaked. "He's still here. Don't let him." Her words cut off abruptly, replaced by a guttural scream as the tapping sound from earlier erupted into a deafening cacophony. It was coming from the shadows in the far corner of the room. I spun, my flashlight sweeping across the darkness. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then it moved, something hunched and impossibly fast, retreating deeper into the shadows as the beam passed over it. "What the—" Aaron started, but his words were drowned out by the sudden slam of the steel door behind us. The room plunged into chaos. The woman in the chair was thrashing, screaming incoherently, while the tapping sound grew louder, more frantic. Aaron and I moved instinctively, backing toward the woman, our guns trained on the shadows. "Show yourself," Aaron shouted, his voice firm but edged with panic. The thing in the corner stopped moving. For a moment, the only sound was the woman's ragged breathing and the faint hum of the bulb overhead. Then, slowly, it stepped into the light. I faced killers. I've seen what desperation and evil can do to a person. But this wasn't human. It stood on 2 legs, but they were wrong, jointed backward like a bird's. Its skin was mottled and stretched taut over its bony frame, and its eyes, God, its eyes were hollow, like pits that swallowed the light. Aaron fired first. The gunshot echoed deafeningly in the small room, but the thing didn't flinch. Instead, it tilted its head, as if curious, before lunging forward with inhuman speed. I barely had time to react. Aaron was closest, and it hit him like a freight train, slamming him into the wall with a sickening crack. His gun clattered to the ground as he fell limp. I fired once, twice, but my bullets seemed to do nothing. The creature turned toward me, its head twitching unnaturally, and for the first time, I understood the raw, primal fear that had gripped the woman in the chair. "Get out!" she screamed, her voice hoarse. "It's playing with you." The creature lunged again, and I dove to the side, my flashlight tumbling from my hand. In the flickering light, I saw Aaron stirring, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead. "Get her out of here!" I shouted, scrambling to my feet. Aaron groaned but managed to crawl toward the woman, his movements sluggish but determined. I kept my gun trained on the creature, though my hands were shaking so badly I could barely aim. "Come on, you bastard," I muttered, backing toward the door. "Come at me." It didn't hesitate. The thing moved in a blur, its clawed hand swiping toward me. I ducked, feeling the air whoosh past as it narrowly missed my head. My back hit the door, and I fumbled for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Behind me, I heard Aaron freeing the woman from the chair. Her sobs were loud, frantic. "It's not real," she kept saying. "It's not real, it's not real." I wasn't so sure. The creature loomed over me now, its twisted face inches from mine. Its breath was rancid, like rot and sulfur, and its hollow eyes seemed to stare straight into my soul. Then, just as I thought it was over, something incredible happened. The bulb overhead exploded, plunging the room into darkness. The room went pitch black. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning out everything but the faint rasp of my own breath. Then came the sound, the tapping, slow and deliberate, circling us in the darkness. Aaron groaned somewhere to my left. "I can't see," he muttered, his voice unsteady. "Stay low," I whispered, "and keep moving." The creature was still here. I could feel it, a heavy, suffocating presence that seemed to press against my chest. My flashlight had rolled somewhere in the chaos, but I couldn't risk fumbling for it. Any sound might draw it closer. Then I heard a soft shuffle, so faint it could have been imagined, except it was right next to me. I froze, holding my breath as the tapping sound paused, just inches away. I reached for my side, my fingers brushing the handle of my knife. Slowly, carefully, I pulled it free, my movements agonizingly slow. In the silence, every second stretched into an eternity. And then it struck. The creature lunged, its claws slicing through the air where I'd been crouched. I rolled to the side, slashing blindly with the knife. I felt it connect. A sickening, wet sound followed by an inhuman screech that echoed through the room. The force of its movement sent me sprawling, and my hand slammed into something hard and cold, my flashlight. I grabbed it, flipping the switch as I scrambled to my feet. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the creature as it writhed, clutching at its side where black, tar-like ichor oozed from a gash. For the first time, it hesitated, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. "Go!" I shouted at Aaron, who was helping the woman toward the door. "I'll hold it off." "Like hell you will," he barked. But there was no time to argue. The creature let out a guttural roar and charged, its skeletal limbs moving with terrifying speed. I ducked under its swipe, slamming the butt of the flashlight into its head. The impact sent it staggering, but only for a moment. It turned on me with a feral snarl, and I braced myself for the inevitable. Then the woman screamed, and the creature stopped. Its head jerked toward her, its body twitching violently. For a moment, it stood frozen, its limbs contorted at impossible angles. Then, slowly, it backed away, retreating into the shadows. "What the hell?" Aaron muttered, his arm wrapped around the woman as he steadied her. I didn't have an answer. The creature was gone, but the oppressive weight in the air remained. I shone the flashlight around the room, half expecting it to lunge from the darkness, but there was nothing. "It's scared of her," I said, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. "Why?" The woman shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. "You don't understand," she whispered. "It's not scared of me. It wants me." Before I could ask what she meant, the steel door burst open with a deafening crash. Light flooded the room as backup finally arrived. Uniformed officers with guns drawn, their faces grim. The woman collapsed into Aaron's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. I slumped against the wall, my legs trembling as the adrenaline wore off. "What the hell happened here?" one of the officers asked, his eyes scanning the room. Aaron and I exchanged a glance. "I don't even know where to start," I admitted. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Later that night, back at the station, I was reviewing the body cam footage. Most of it was useless, static and distortion, but then, just for a moment, there it was, the creature's face, staring directly into the camera. And in the background, barely audible, the woman's voice. "It's not real," but it was. And somehow I knew it wasn't finished with us. The footage haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature's face. The hollow eyes, the twisted frame, the black ichor dripping from its gash. I replayed the woman's words in my head, over and over. "It's not real," but it was real. I'd seen it, felt it. Aaron and I were ordered to take the next few days off. Standard procedure after a traumatic encounter, they said. But there was nothing standard about this. I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd brought something back with us. On the second night, I woke to the sound of tapping. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, some lingering remnant of the horrors we'd faced in the warehouse. But as I lay there, frozen in the darkness, the sound grew louder. It was coming from the window. Tap, tap, tap. I reached for my gun on the nightstand, my hand trembling as I flipped on the bedside lamp. The room flooded with light, but the tapping didn't stop. Slowly, I turned toward the window. There was nothing there. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself it was just the wind, maybe a branch brushing against the glass. But when I pulled the curtain aside, my blood ran cold. On the outside of the window, written in a black, tar-like substance, was a single word, mine. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I grabbed my phone and called Aaron, my hands shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to hit the right number. "Yeah?" he answered groggily, his voice thick with sleep. "Aaron?" I whispered, glancing back at the window. "It's here." There was a long pause on the other end. "What do you mean, it's here?" "I mean the creature, or something. It left a message on my damn window." Aaron cursed under his breath. "Stay put. I'm coming over." 20 minutes later, he arrived, his gun drawn as he scanned the perimeter. I let him in, locking the door behind him. We both stood in the kitchen, staring at the window from a safe distance. "Where is it now?" he asked, his voice low. "I don't know," I admitted, "but it's not done with us." Aaron didn't argue. He'd seen it too, after all. We decided to check the footage from our body cams again, desperate for some clue. Aaron set up his laptop on the kitchen table, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he pulled up the files. Most of it was still distorted, flickering static interspersed with brief, disjointed clips. But then we found something. In one frame, just before the creature retreated into the shadows, the woman's face flashed across the screen. Her expression was blank, her eyes glassy, as if she were in some kind of trance. Behind her, in the shadows, the creature loomed, its hollow eyes fixed on her like a predator sizing up its prey. But then the screen glitched, and for a split second, her face changed. It wasn't blank anymore, it was smiling. Not a normal smile, but something cruel, malicious. And her eyes, they weren't her eyes. They were hollow. "What the hell is this?" Aaron whispered, leaning closer to the screen. I didn't answer, couldn't. My mind was racing, piecing together fragments of what I'd seen and heard. The woman had said the creature wasn't scared of her. It wanted her. But what if it wasn't her it wanted? What if it already had her? A sudden crash from the living room made us both jump. Aaron grabbed his gun, and I followed, my heart pounding as we crept toward the sound. The room was empty, but the front door was wide open, the lock shattered. Outside, in the darkness, the tapping began again. Slow, deliberate, circling the house. Tap, tap, tap. "It's playing with us," Aaron said, his voice tight. "No," I replied, my mouth dry. "It's hunting." We stood in the doorway, staring out into the dark, the cold air pressing against our faces. The tapping was coming from somewhere just beyond the porch, but no matter where I shone the flashlight, there was nothing. No movement, no figure, just the endless, oppressive black of the night. Aaron nudged my arm. "Inside," he said, his voice low but firm. "Now." We retreated into the house, locking the door behind us, though we both knew it wouldn't stop whatever this thing was. Aaron pulled the blinds closed while I checked the back windows. Every corner of the house felt too exposed, too vulnerable. The tapping continued, moving from one window to the next. It wasn't random, it was deliberate, methodical, like it was searching for a way in. "We're not dealing with a ghost," Aaron muttered, pacing the room. "This thing's physical. We can kill it." "Can we?" I shot back, gripping my flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Did you see what it did at the warehouse? Bullets didn't do a damn thing." Aaron opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of shattering glass cut him off. We spun toward the living room, where one of the windows had exploded inward. A gust of cold air swept through the room, carrying with it the metallic stench of decay. And then we heard it, the thing's voice. Mine. It wasn't a scream or a growl. It was a whisper, soft and wet, like something spoken from the back of a throat full of water. It echoed through the room, crawling under my skin and setting every nerve on edge. Aaron raised his gun, his eyes darting wildly. "Show yourself," he barked. Silence. Then, from the shadows near the broken window, something moved. The flashlight's beam landed on it, and my stomach churned. It was the creature, but it was different now, larger, its limbs more contorted, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. And it wasn't alone. Behind it, more shapes slithered into view, their bodies twisting and shifting as if they were barely held together. Aaron fired. The shot rang out, deafening in the small space, and the creature staggered back, black ichor spraying from the wound. But it didn't fall. Instead, it let out a low, guttural growl and lunged forward, its clawed hand swiping at Aaron. He dove out of the way, but one of the smaller creatures was on him in an instant, its bony fingers wrapping around his leg. He kicked at it desperately, but it held fast, pulling him toward the shadows. "Help!" he shouted, panic breaking through his usual calm. I didn't think, I just acted. Grabbing the nearest thing within reach, a heavy lamp, I swung it with all my strength, shattering it against the creature's head. It released Aaron with a hiss, retreating into the darkness. Upstairs, I yelled, dragging him to his feet. "We need to get to higher ground." We bolted up the staircase, the creatures swarming behind us. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, like puppets being yanked on invisible strings. One of them reached for me, its claws grazing my ankle, but I kicked it away and slammed the bedroom door shut behind us. "We can't keep running," Aaron panted, his back against the door as he held it shut. "They'll break through eventually." I scanned the room, my mind racing. The tapping had stopped, replaced by the sound of claws scraping against the door. They were trying to get in. Then I remembered something. The woman's words, the strange footage of her face on the body cam. It's not real, but it was. And yet, somehow it wasn't. What if we're fighting it wrong? I said more to myself than to Aaron. He frowned. "What are you talking about?" "This thing, it's not just physical. It's something else. Psychological. It's in our heads." Aaron stared at me, his face pale. "You think it's manipulating us?" I nodded. "If we keep fighting it like it's just a monster, we'll lose. We need to fight it on its terms." The door splintered, claws breaking through the wood. I grabbed Aaron's shoulder. "Do you trust me?" His jaw tightened, but he nodded. "What's the plan?" "We let it in." Aaron's eyes widened. "Are you out of your damn mind?" "Listen to me," I said, gripping his arm. "If this thing is in our heads, if it's feeding off our fear, then running and fighting only make it stronger. We have to face it, break the cycle." The door splintered further, jagged claws tearing through the wood. The air in the room seemed heavier, thick with the stench of rot and the metallic tang of blood. Behind Aaron, the bedroom window rattled as if something, or someone, was trying to force its way in. "We don't have a choice," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "If we don't end this now, it'll keep coming." Aaron hesitated for a moment, then nodded, his face grim. "All right, but if this goes south, I'm blaming you." The door burst open with a deafening crack, and the creatures poured in, twisted forms moving in jerky, unnatural motions. The first one lunged for us, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, but Aaron didn't raise his gun. He stood his ground, and so did I. "Do it," I muttered under my breath, more to myself than to him. The creature hesitated, its head twitching as if confused. The others behind it slowed, their movements uncertain. It was then I realized that they weren't used to prey that didn't run. "You want me?" I shouted, stepping forward. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst, but I forced myself to stand tall. "Here I am. Take me." The lead creature snarled, its jagged mouth twisting into something resembling a grin. It lunged again, and this time I didn't flinch. Its clawed hand wrapped around my throat, cold and unrelenting. The world spun, the edges of my vision darkening, but I focused on its hollow eyes, willing myself to stay present. Somewhere behind me, Aaron yelled my name, but I barely heard him. "You're not real," I whispered, the words scraping out of my throat. The creature froze. Its grip slackened just slightly, and for a moment, I thought I saw something behind those empty eyes. Confusion, maybe even fear. "You're not real," I repeated louder this time. "You don't control me." The air around us seemed to shift, the oppressive weight lifting just slightly. The creature let out an unearthly screech, its head snapping back as if in pain. Behind it, The other creatures began to writhe, their forms flickering like static on a broken screen. Aaron grabbed my arm, pulling me back as the creature released me. "It's working," he said, his voice urgent. "Keep going. You're not real," I shouted, stepping toward the creatures now. "Whatever you are, whatever you want, you don't control us." The lead creature's form began to dissolve, its jagged edges breaking apart into tendrils of black smoke. The others followed, their bodies unraveling as they let out distorted, garbled cries. The room filled with the smell of burning hair and sulfur, the smoke swirling and coalescing into a single point before disappearing entirely. And then, just like that, it was over. The room was silent. The shattered door hung limply on its hinges, and the faint glow of dawn seeped through the cracks in the blinds. Aaron and I stood there, breathing hard, our eyes darting around the room as if expecting the creatures to reappear. But they didn't. "What the hell just happened?" Aaron finally said, his voice hoarse. I shook my head, leaning against the wall to steady myself. "I don't know, but I think we won." In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. The creatures were gone, but their presence lingered like a shadow in the corner of my mind. Aaron and I never talked about what happened that night, and I didn't review the footage again. Some things are better left buried. But every now and then, late at night, I hear it. The faint sound of tapping, slow and deliberate, somewhere just beyond the edge of the light. And I wonder if we truly defeated it, or if it's just waiting for the next time we let our guard down. The weeks after that night blurred together in a haze of routine and denial. Aaron and I returned to work, but everything felt off. The department sent us for mandatory psych evaluations, and though we both passed, I could tell Aaron wasn't sleeping. Neither was I. The tapping didn't stop. It came at odd hours, sometimes faint, like a whisper against glass, other times loud and insistent, echoing through the stillness of my house. I ignored it at first, chalking it up to paranoia. But it wasn't just the noise, it was the feeling. That heavy, oppressive presence, like eyes watching me from the dark. I knew it wasn't over. Then one night it escalated. It was 2:47 a.m. when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. The screen lit up with a single notification. Unknown caller. My heart sank. I didn't want to answer it, but something compelled me to. My hand shook as I swiped to accept the call. "Hello." My voice was barely a whisper. For a moment there was silence. Then, the faint crackle of static, followed by a familiar voice. "It's not real." The line went dead. I sat there, staring at the phone, my chest tightening with a mixture of fear and anger. It was her voice, the woman from the warehouse. The one we'd rescued. But how? And why? Before I could process it, a loud bang echoed from downstairs. My blood ran cold. Grabbing my gun, I moved cautiously toward the staircase, every step feeling heavier than the last. The house was dark, the faint glow of the streetlights outside casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. "Who's there?" I called, my voice steadier than I felt. No answer. I reached the bottom of the stairs, sweeping the flashlight across the living room. At first, everything seemed normal, until I saw the front door. It was wide open, swinging gently on its hinges. The cold night air seeped into the house, carrying with it that all-too-familiar stench of rot. And then I heard it, the tapping. This time, it wasn't at the windows. It was coming from the kitchen. Slow, deliberate, each tap sending a shiver down my spine. I tightened my grip on the gun, moving toward the sound. The kitchen was empty, or so I thought. As I turned, the beam of my flashlight caught something scrawled on the wall in the same black, tar-like substance as before. The words were jagged, uneven, as if written in a frenzy. "It's your turn." A cold hand clamped down on my shoulder, and I spun around, firing instinctively. The gunshot echoed through the house, deafening in the small space. But there was nothing there. No creature, no intruder. Just the empty air and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I staggered back, my flashlight flickering as the tapping started again. This time louder, more insistent. It was coming from all around me now, echoing through the walls, the floors, the very air itself. And then I saw it. In the reflection of the kitchen window, just behind me, stood the woman. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and her mouth twisted into that same cruel, malicious smile I'd seen in the body cam footage. "It's your turn," she whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally as the light overhead flickered and went out. I spun around, but the kitchen was empty. The tapping stopped. The house was silent again. For now. Epilogue: I quit the force the next day. Aaron did too. We never spoke about it, and I didn't ask if he was hearing the tapping or seeing the reflections. I already knew the answer. It's been 6 months since that night. I've moved 3 times, changed my number, even disconnected from the grid entirely. But no matter where I go, it finds me. The tapping, the whispers, the reflections, and the words scrawled on the walls, written in that dark, dripping substance. It's your turn. I've stopped running now. I know there's no escape. I'm writing this because someday someone will hear the tapping too. And when it's your turn, you'll understand. After that night, I knew there would be no running, no hiding, no pretending the nightmare wasn't real. Whatever this thing was, whatever I had let into my life, it wouldn't stop until it consumed me. The tapping, the whispers, the shadows, they weren't just warnings. They were promises. The final confrontation came on a stormy night, fittingly enough. Thunder growled low and constant, shaking the foundation of the small cabin I'd rented in the middle of nowhere. I had come here thinking isolation might break its hold on me, that cutting myself off from the world might somehow sever the connection. But it had followed. Of course it had. At exactly 3:13 a.m., the tapping began again. This time it wasn't subtle. It pounded on every surface. The walls, the windows, even the roof, like 1,000 skeletal fingers drumming in perfect unison. I sat at the edge of the bed, gripping my gun, my breaths shallow and rapid. "I'm done running," I whispered to the empty room. My voice sounded foreign, brittle, like it might crack apart if I spoke any louder. The room grew colder, the air so thick it felt like trying to breathe through a wet cloth. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the tapping stopped. The silence was worse. A single word, wet and guttural, echoed through the room. "Mine." The light overhead flickered, and the shadows in the corners began to shift. I stood, gripping the gun tightly, though deep down I knew it wouldn't make a difference. The shadows coalesced, pulling together into a single form. The creature stepped forward, its twisted limbs dragging across the floor, its hollow eyes fixed on me. But it wasn't alone. Behind it, other shapes emerged, their forms flickering and shifting like static. At their center was the woman, the one we'd rescued from the warehouse. Her smile was wider now, impossibly wide, stretching her face into something inhuman. "You let us in," she whispered, her voice layered with something deeper, something older. "Now it's time to join us." I raised the gun, aiming directly at her. "You won't take me," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. She laughed, the sound sharp and piercing, like glass shattering. "It's not about taking," she said. "It's about becoming." The creatures moved closer, their movements slow, deliberate. My heart thundered in my chest, but I forced myself to stand my ground. I thought of everything Aaron and I had gone through, the fear, the losses, the unanswered questions. And then I thought of the words I had repeated that night in the warehouse. "It's not real." But this time I didn't believe it, because it was real, and the only way out was through. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, lowering the gun. "Do your worst." The woman tilted her head, her smile faltering for the first time. The creatures stopped, their hollow eyes fixed on me as if waiting for something. And then they lunged. The world dissolved into chaos. Claws and shadows and whispers surrounded me, pulling me down into the dark. My body felt weightless, my mind stretched thin, like I was unraveling piece by piece. I tried to fight, but there was nothing to fight against, just endless, suffocating black. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. I woke up on the floor of the cabin, the faint light of dawn filtering through the broken windows. The air was still, the tapping gone. But I wasn't alone. In the corner of the room stood a single figure, tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes and twisted limbs. It stared at me, unblinking, its head cocked to the side like a curious animal. And then it smiled. It was my smile. Did you like these stories? Write in the comments. And please write what you didn't like. It will be useful for me to know your opinion. And I will improve my work. Thank you. Subscribe to my channel and click the bell so as not to miss new stories. I try for you.